Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's discussion, Women, Life, Freedom, Iran's Movement for Women's Rights. My name is Dennis Mitchell, and I serve as Vice President for University Life. We have a very important conversation lined up for you today, and I'm going to keep my remarks very short so we can just get to it. Our conversation today will be a moderated panel discussion for the first segment, followed by a Q&A session. And we have a wonderful panel of experts whom I'll introduce in a moment. First, I want to share a quick word about University Life. We are a hub of Columbia student life. We share information, resources, events, and initiatives that support inclusion and belonging, health and well-being, and community citizenship. Next, I want to give a big thanks to our co-sponsors in the Office of the President and to all of our outreach partners across the university, with particular thanks to the Committee on Global Thought and the Office of Public Affairs. So some logistics for the day. Questions. Thank you to the many of you who submitted questions in advance. We're grateful. If you have questions during this discussion, please submit them through the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of your screens if you're on Zoom. We'll try our best to get to as many of them as we can. If you're watching by live stream, please send your questions via email to universitylife@columbia.edu. I'll say that one more time, universitylife@columbia.edu. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the University Life's website within the next week. Now, on to today's events. In the wake of 22-year-old Mahsa Jhina Amini's mid-September death after she was arrested by Iran's morality police for improper veiling, the world has witnessed a political movement led by young Iranian women. In response to her death, demonstrators and their allies across Iran and in many parts of the world have unified around the motto, Women, Life, Freedom, elemental demands for basic human rights. Once again, the Columbia community is witnessing history as it unfolds. While these events are challenging, even from afar, they are also critically important for our community to notice, to consider, and most importantly, to seek and understand. As the father of 3 daughters, I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the incredible group of speakers we've assembled here. I'm going to share their briefest of introductions to give them as much time as possible for discussion. But I will say this, we have an extraordinary group with us today. And as I always do, I encourage you to go online and learn more about each and every one of them. Our moderator for today is Vishaka Desai, Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to the President of Columbia University. She also serves as chair of the Committee on Global Thought and is a senior research scholar in global studies at the School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome. Our panelists, Yasmin Ergas, who is a senior lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs. She also serves as director of the specialization on gender and public policy at SIPA. Welcome. Manija Moridian, assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College. Welcome. Kian Tajbakhsh, who is a senior advisor at Columbia Global Centers, as well as a fellow with the Committee on Global Thought. Welcome. Parisa Taranafar, who is an associate professor of epidemiology at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, with a focus on community and public health. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to you, Professor Desai.
Thank you, Dennis, and greetings, everyone. I am absolutely honored to be invited to moderate this very important discussion, timely and significant for all of us. I want to also thank both the Office of the President and the Office of University Life for organizing this session. As Mr. Mitchell said, I am absolutely thrilled to have such extraordinary group of scholars and colleagues right here at Columbia and Barnard for us to really understand what is going on in Iran, why is it important, and why is it important not only for Iran, but for all of us, no matter where we reside. I come to this particular program and this issue both as a concerned global citizen, but also as a daughter of freedom fighters in India and a daughter of a mother who was one of the co-founders of one of the first women's institutions in India. So when we think about this idea of women's protest, I always recognize that as Hillary Clinton declared at the time of the Beijing conference, that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. So this issue is not just about women, but it is also about how it affects all of us and why does it matter. So to really help us understand that, we're going to begin with just getting the level ground of knowledge. What's going on? The fact that her death, and that is Mahsa Jhina Amini's death, happened in mid-September. Here we are in early November. Things have not necessarily just died down. So why is that? What's happening on the ground and how is the regime dealing with it? Just to get the level ground of information. So Manijay, I would love to give you the floor to kind of give us a sense of what's going on now and how has it changed from the last 2 months from the beginning till now.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. So I think, as you said, it's very important to keep at the center of our minds that this uprising began spontaneously as a reaction to the murder in police custody of Mahsa Jhina Amini for supposedly improper hijab. And so the protest began with a rejection of what is actually a foundational ideological pillar of the Islamic Republic, and that is compulsory hijab. And I want to emphasize the compulsory hijab, that we are not talking about every hijab everywhere in all places and times. We are talking about the Iranian context in which there is state imposed enforcement of a certain version of hijab. So as a result of this spontaneous rebellion, there is now, almost 2 months later, a broad-based movement, right, that flows from what has become a common sense understanding among women and men across class lines, across ethnic groups and geographic regions of Iran, that patriarchy and authoritarianism go hand in hand, that you cannot be against one without opposing the other. And so compulsory hijab has become the kind of ultimate indictment that crystallizes all of the other failures and injustices of the Iranian government, of which there are many. And I think that's why we see the movement is sustained. That's why I think we are still seeing, despite ongoing state repression. I mean, we have witnessed tremendous violence from the Iranian government, hundreds of people killed, children, teenagers killed, many, many thousands arrested, right? And yet I think that this level of repression thus far has really backfired. It has radicalized more people. It has undermined the credibility of the regime even further and brought even more unity and more determination. So what we're seeing, I think, is wider sections of the population joining, adding their voices and their grievances to the protest, right? So, I think it's very important. I know we have a lot to cover, but I just want to emphasize for a moment the fact that Jhina Amini was Kurdish, a Kurdish woman, and that the protests began in her hometown and region in Iranian Kurdistan. And this is very important to understand also, because it has been impossible because of this to ignore the connections between the systemic persecution of women in Iran and that of ethnic and religious minorities. Kurds are Sunni, and the majority of Iranians are Shiite, and the government is a Shiite hegemonic, government. So in fact, there is, I think, what we might call a kind of intersectional understanding of the overlapping oppressions that Amini faced as a Kurdish woman, and that actually come together to undergird the regime. So the slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom," goes back at least a decade to the Kurdish liberation movement, which has had an explicitly feminist orientation for many years. And I think it really represents the desire for a totally different society in which the freedom of women would entail a better life for everybody.
I think it's very important that people don't understand, for example, why do we use two names? And that actually, it's very interesting that you didn't use the word Mahsa, because in fact her Kurdish name is Jhina. And that in itself kind of recognizes that notion of where the fault lines are and what's going on. I think, Parisa, I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about the fact that not only has it been going on, but the young women have been on the front line of this change, and also other young men and women are on the front line. But at the same time, there are also public health doctors and professional women who have really come in. So how do you think of this from the issue of public health, which is your specialty as a medical doctor, and why people are really concerned about this, because it has to do with human beings and the body of women that actually has a huge amount of implications.
Thank you so much for that question, Vishaka. And I really do appreciate having this opportunity to bring in a public health perspective into this really important conversation. I want to just make a correction that I am true and true a public health professional. So I have a doctorate in public health, not a medical doctor. So just a little bit of a maybe correction there. And so, so I want to use that public health, you know, as it's my professional vantage point, but also I use a lot of my own lived experiences and personal reckoning and reflections in trying to process and understand what's going on in Iran. And, you know, I'm going to use all of that, you know, I think to answer some of your questions. And I love that you started with the quote that women's rights are human rights. And I want to add to that and say health is a human right. So that has been articulated by the World Health Organization since the 1940s. And we in public health, you know, function on that. So I would say any type of movement that's about freedom, human rights, and justice is by definition also a public health movement, and we should be paying attention to it. So in terms of what's going on from a health perspective, I think we can see that some of the health ramifications are really, really immediate and visible, right? So, and it's mostly like these physical brutality or violence that we see that have been unleashed on the protesters, women and men, that have been captured in recordings and photos and shared now widely. And here's a place where I want to maybe acknowledge to the all Iranians, but Iranian diaspora who've been really glued somewhat to unfiltered social media coverage of some of these acts that have been very difficult, because we're bearing witness to some things that are also part of some of our own experiences and memories, either personal or through our families and communities. So virtual hug to everyone.
Yeah.
And also, you know, I think it's also a very good illustration of a point I want to make, which is like the violence that we're seeing and some of these effects. It's not just limited to people who are directly experiencing it, and it really does have a ripple effect across families and communities and societies. And now we have so much knowledge about how these kind of things actually can even be passed on intergenerationally. So the public health impact of all of this, I think, is really huge. And I want to also say that while some of these things that we witness and we see particularly might seem very unique and specific to what's going on in Iran right now, but obviously there are a lot of parallels and commonalities between them and some of the public health challenges and social challenges that we have at home. So, you know, the death of Mahsa Amini, which was the spark of the movement, is about violence against women, but also because of the control of women's body, which is not new or unique
Right.
Iran. So
And we
glad-
will have a chance to talk about that in terms of the broader perspective, so that we understand that things that happen in one place are not just isolated. There is actually relevance for all of us. One of the things that I've been very struck by, and Kian, I wanted to ask you this question, and I'm going to ask all of my panelists to try to be as brief as possible. I mean, we could go on for a whole day, and we don't have a whole day, but 1 hour. So we want to get at a lot of the different questions. So if you don't mind, I will try to jump in from time to time. But Kian, one of the things that I was very struck by is that when I was in Iran in 1997, early 98, I actually was stopped by the morality police because my hijab was not all the way to the forehead in a specific way. I was taken away because they thought I was Iranian, and then I couldn't understand a word of Farsi, and finally they had to let me go. And of course, I was also with some Euro-American colleagues. But it seemed to me that since then, things had opened up a little bit. I could see pictures of people wearing hijab in a very different way than what I was asked to do then. So what is different about this moment and this protest compared to what has happened before, including the Green Movement or even the 79 movement? And why at this moment hijab should become such a big issue than what might have been 5 years ago?
Well, great question. And again, thank you for inviting me and organizing this important event. I think that, your question raises, points us to recall an important fact, which is that there is both continuity and discontinuity in these protests. First of all, women in Iran have been valiantly struggling for their rights for many decades, even before the 1979 revolution. But if we just focus on the post-79 period, it's been the case that there have been many movements and attempts to institute reforms and demand greater rights and freedoms for women over these last 4 decades. One could say that they have not been successful, that they have, in fact, not to put too fine a point on it, that they failed. And in a sense, this generation both continues the efforts of the women that have been struggling in the last several decades, but also there's something new. So let me just point out what I think is new. What is very striking about this particular protest is that it's coming from a generation, and I think our listeners should understand, most of the protesters in the street are in their late teens and going to 25, 26. I think one news report was that almost 70–80% of the people who have been arrested are between the ages of 17 and 25 and 26. Those are essentially, college students and, early, let's say, master's students or early career young adults. And what's important about this is that these are entirely the product of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They were born in Iran, they grew up in Iran, and why that's important is that all schooling, all culture, all access to media, all access to news has been controlled by the Islamic Republic of Iran government. And so what's happening is that you have a generation that should have been the pure products of the desires of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they have turned their back. I mean, this group of protesters, and I want to make that point. Maybe we can talk about it later. Perhaps this whole generation of protesters do not speak for all young people in Iran, but nonetheless, this group is a pure product of the Islamic Republic's attempts to socialize them into the norms and values of fundamentalist Islam,
and
they turn their back on them now. So I think this is what is very distinctive.
So I would love to ask all of you, to say, you know, it seems to me that yes, they are the product of the Islamic Republic. And at the same time, it seems like they're also the Generation Z and the product of this global age. So that at some point, somehow, they are not isolated to the extent that the generation prior to the internet generation might be. I mean, how do we explain that? Is it just because they've just had enough? But is it also because they're still getting some access to outside world? It's not as if the walls are completely non-permeable. Any one of you? And let's start with you, Manijay.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's been a lot of commentary about the role of social media. I mean, even going back to the Green Uprising, the kind of reformist uprising in 2009, demanding free and fair elections, you know, was using Twitter and, you know, all of these things. And so I think it's absolutely the case that despite the fact that all of this social media is banned in Iran, Iranians, young Iranians in particular, are extremely skilled at using filters and VPNs and all sorts of creative strategies to access the full range of global social media. And so it's an important point because I think too often we, especially in the US, we've sort of been trained to think of Iran as this kind of ultimate other, this totally different,
Hermeneutically enclosed,
yeah, as if it's removed from the rest of global history or the flow of ideas and culture, you know, and it's absolutely not. And so part of this is yes, if you listen to some of the video blogs that young protesters, the messages, you know, that they've posted, they're saying, you know, we see how other people live around the world, and why do we have to live like this? It's not fair, right? So there is that point of comparison. But I think it's also in a context in which the Iranian government, through its own corruption, mismanagement, and authoritarianism, has alienated many, many generations, but also can't provide for people. And this is where I also want to bring in the impact of, you know, over 4 decades of sanctions, you know, which were ratcheted up, of course, under Trump, and have continued, that you have a real decline in the standard of living, not just for poor and working class Iranians, but really for the middle class. That there was already, before the death of Amini, there was already a powder keg brewing, right? I mean, we saw economic protests erupt in 2017 and again in 2019 that were brutally suppressed. But you have a whole generation that was convinced we have no future. There are no jobs for this very educated generation, right? The currency is devalued, inflation's through the roof. There's just this sense that you know, you cannot imagine how you're going to have a decent life in this society, right? People are hungry at night, right? I mean, there's really a crisis economically.
So what you're saying is that,
yeah,
it seems to me that what you're saying is that hijab is a trigger point. The issue is a trigger point, but it then explodes because of all the rest of the economic and political conditions.
absolutely.
Yasmin, it seems to me that as a student of feminist movements everywhere, and to really kind of think about this in a broader context, how do you look at the Iranian movement led by women, young women at that, in terms of other feminist movements that have come from other locations? And what is the relationship? And perhaps you can also get a little bit into the problematics of the comparison that often becomes also evident.
Yeah. Well, so thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for that question. I'm very struck by what's happening in Iran. And in part, I come from a long time past of having been a very active participant in the Italian feminist movement, and in particular in the mobilization for reproductive rights at a moment when Italian politics was very heavily conditioned by, still quite heavily conditioned by, religious authority. And so mobilizing over a question like abortion, in what was effectively, you know, a heavily Catholic context, was provided many challenges that, of course, were very different, but evoke for me some parallelisms. You know, in the past few years, when we've looked at gender and feminist movements, we've thought a lot about the repression that they've received, and the use of gender as a mobilizing issue for illiberal authoritarian governments and movements. So we've seen that in a variety of contexts. We've seen that here in the United States very powerfully. We're living with that kind of anti-gender, anti-feminist mobilization that is the, not just the legacy, but the present, I think, of a very powerful social movement, but we've seen it in many other parts of the world. What I think is very striking about what's happening in Iran is the way in which it raises for us the exact opposite. It flips the terms, so to speak. And so now what we're seeing, and we've seen it in other places as well, but what we're seeing is a movement for women's rights that is in opposition to authoritarianism and in opposition to illiberal government. And it seems to me that at the center of this, as in so many other cases, for the liberals and for the illiberals, and I use those terms loosely, of course, a central question is the issue of women as the protagonists of a demand for full, call it citizenship, call it equality, call it self-determination, but very much for women to be able to control their own bodies. These are issues that I think of as coming under the general umbrella of habeas corpus. And so whether it is how you present yourself in the public sphere, or whether it is the question of violence against women, or whether it is questions like abortion, or a whole host of issues, at the center of the discourse is the issue that women are embodied beings who are entitled to their own embodiment, to the subjectivity of that embodiment. And from there, they become the mobilizers for a much broader discourse on citizenship and rights. And I think that if I've understood correctly, I think that's something that is happening today in Iran and has happened in other places as well.
No, I mean, I think and Manijay, absolutely, I would love for you to chime in. I think in a way, what you're saying is that when we say women's rights are human rights, this is actually operationally happening. What does it mean? It does mean something about the rights to your body is about human rights. And so when you say habeas corpus, Yasmin, just in one sentence, explain to our audience, because it may not be clear, what do you mean by habeas corpus of women's?
I have a very simple definition of it, which is not politically fitting with the political genealogy of the term, but what I mean by that is the right to possess your own embodied being, to be the subject of your own physical self. And it seems to me that that's a crucial element of personhood, and that unless you can claim that, it's extraordinarily difficult to claim equality as a citizen or a participant in a polity. Right. And that's what really I think is the issue. Right. And that the history, what Manijay said earlier, patriarchy and authoritarianism. Yes, patriarchy is about the non-possession by women of themselves.
Right.
That's exactly what it means.
Yeah. So Manijay, one word, intervention, and then I want to go to Kian.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on this question of embodiment, because I think that what's happening, part of the drama of this moment and its unprecedented nature, is that for decades, Iranian women have been breaking the rules in private, with legal parties and, listening to band music and doing everything behind closed doors. What we see now is a kind of public collective embodiment of resistance. And what we see is that Iranian women are overcoming the alienation from their own bodies that has been the result of this kind of state form of compulsory hijab and other forms of legal gender segregation and discrimination in Iran. So these images we've seen of women publicly burning their hijabs and dancing around bonfires and, you know, taking up public space and fighting back against security forces, all of this is a process of transformation of one's relationship to one's own body, you know, to see the body not as a site of surveillance and policing and shame and humiliation, but as a site of pleasure and joy and liberation. And so I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to, because it's that kind of deep embodied transformation of subjectivity that you can't really turn that back. Do you know what I mean? That's a kind of irreversible process, I think.
But I think, Kian, you mentioned earlier and referred to it, and that is this a generational issue? Is this a class issue? Is it an urban issue and not necessarily shared by all? So how does the regime react to this depending on who they think their clientele is, right? Or who their constituency is. So can you say a word about how do we look at that in the context of where Iran is today?
Sure, that's an excellent follow-on, I think, from the debates. I mean, I would add another dimension to this discussion, I think, to really complicate the situation a bit. And that is to say, I think that one of the things that is very distinctive about this current protest movement is it is a cry for recognition. I mean, it's a recognition of a generation that, just as Manijay mentioned, and you mentioned, Vishaka, too, my point was saying that they were supposed to be the products of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but they have turned their backs on their values because they've been socialized into international, global, and what they consider to be very, very normal. I mean, I have to say, we were walking with my family through campus the other day, and one of the members of my family got very emotional. She said, look at all these young women sitting around on the steps of Low Library, and the young women in Iran cannot do that. But the young women in Iran who are protesting believe that that's normal and that it's not too much to ask. Now, this point brings me to the important point. That is, I think that part of what the protest is expressing is the emergence in Iran of a culture clash and even a culture war. And what that means is that even though a part of the young generation and a part of the population believes in the kinds of individual autonomy that we understand to be part of women's rights, not all of the population in Iran do. And I would dare say not all of the population even in the West do. That is to say, there is a distinction between a highly individualized and a communitarian view of norms. And so when you have rules and regulations about modesty, about dress, and so forth, these aren't always expressions of a repressive society or let's say an authoritarian society, although in the Iranian current case it is. But I'm just saying that it does express different views about what is the good life, what is a good society, and the right balance between individual and communal norms. And so I think that it's important to understand that I think there is a large minority, a significant minority in Iran, probably 15%, 10 to 15% of the population, this is an estimate I make, let us say several million people in Iran who support the regime and who support mandatory veiling. They believe that that is the right way to comport yourself in public and so forth. And so I think that going forward, what we're going to see is what these brave young women and men have done, have put on the agenda for Iranian society and also for the Iranian government, but more for Iranian society, a very contradictory views of what it means to be an individual, what it means to have individual rights. And I don't think this is going to go away, even if the regime is toppled and overthrown. This is going to be something that the society is going to have to handle and manage. So I wouldn't say this is necessarily an urban thing, Vishaka. I wouldn't say even this is necessarily a class thing. I think it is a generational issue, but I think that what's happened is that we have now in Iran a clear articulation of a view of individual autonomy shared by, led by young women, but also shared by many men, that the kinds of individual rights we see in the West should be normal, they should be accorded respect and recognition, but this is going to be something that a complex country with a large conservative minority are going to have to manage in the years to come.
Well, I think that the operative word you're using is large conservative minority, ultra conservative minority, so that the pressure points have now become too tight. And therefore, is it a breaking point? And are we then going to have to come up with yet another way? Or who is we anyway? But I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit, and lots of questions are coming in as well. And part of it is that I just noticed that the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Greenfield, has actually said that she wants the expulsion of Iran from the Council of Women's Rights of the UN. It's a small point, but still a big deal. And Iran has said that they actually refuse to acknowledge that they have done something that was in violation of the rights. So I thought it was sort of surprising that they actually would go to say that they have not violated women's rights because it's within the law. And I think that that brings up the question of the international community. Where and how, and this is also one of the questions that comes up, and that is that how do we in the world beyond Iran think about what is the role of the international community? What is the role? I mean, the diaspora is one thing, but it's a broader international community. And how do we think of this? Because also students are asked, a number of people are asking about what can we do when we are here? Anybody who would like to start? Yasmin, why don't we start with you and then go to others? Yeah. You're muted.
I was saying, as the non-Iranian on the panelist, I'm a little bit hesitant, but I think that in terms of the role of the Iranian, of the international community vis-a-vis what is happening in Iran at the moment, it's really important to consider that these are key institutions. I believe that they are key institutions. I think that the question of belonging to the Human Rights Council or to the Commission on the Status of Women or to whatever it may be, there are rules for that participation that ought to be recognized. I equally think that the violation of rights that seems to be occurring is a really egregious one, and one for which I think that states need to be able to be held accountable. I think that is not something that should be done only in the case of Iran. I think it's extremely important that it should be done generally when states violate the human rights of their citizens that they themselves have recognized. And it's really important to do that. I think states, all states, including the United States, and very much including the United States, but European states, many states, tend to use sovereignty as a cover for wrongdoing, tend to say, you have no business intervening. This is not your sphere, and that is why this is not illegal. This is where we are autonomous and independent. But in fact, to the extent to which we still have an international order that holds, that is not the case. States have signed on to human rights. It is the case that there are both treaty norms and customary norms that concern human rights and women's rights, and they need to be respected. I wanted to come back very quickly to where you started, Vishaka, women's rights are human rights, because this conversation has made me think that normally the way you hear that is, therefore women are entitled to human rights. But in this context, I also hear Therefore, the rights that women are claiming are the entitlement of the entire population.
Exactly.
I think that equation has
Right.
become much more powerful thanks to this movement.
Right. Part of the one of the questions that's coming in is for the international community is the effect of sanctions on the Iranian communities, and how do we support, or can we support what the young people are asking? Are there other ways to create solidarities across the region? Manije, Parisa, Kian. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think that Iran is probably the most sanctioned country. I mean, Iran has been under massive sanctions for so many decades. So this is a form of collective punishment of the population. Iranians have been punished for the actions of their government, and they're very angry at their government because of that. But I think that from where I sit, we've lived through US invasions in Afghanistan, supposedly to liberate women, in Iraq, supposedly for human rights and against dictatorship. And we've seen that these strategies of foreign states have been debacles, right? They've led to more violence, more misogyny, and massive destruction. So I think we have to be very clear when we're talking about the role of foreign governments to be against those forms of military intervention and against the forms of sanctions that we have in Iran, right? That prevent people from accessing the global economy, right? And create so much misery and deprivation, and in fact, strengthen the hardliners in the regime, because the people who benefit from the black markets, the people who benefit from the money that's there to be made when you have an economy under sanctions are the people in power. Right. So it's under maximum pressure sanctions of Trump that we see this consolidation behind the current hardline President Raisi, and the crackdown even on hijab that emerges, in that context. So I think we need to move away from those kind of top-down approaches to thinking about international community, and instead, I believe, shift our focus towards creating grassroots networks of activists, of civil society organizations, of feminist organizations, right? Who can connect and figure out what are the links between our efforts to fight for bodily autonomy, to fight against fundamentalisms of all kinds, whether they're Christian or Hindu or Muslim, right? And to actually make connections between our different movements as peers, right? That Iranian women and men, they don't need to be saved or rescued. They need solidarity. And that's what they're asking for. They're saying, uplift our voices, uplift our demands, support us. We're fighting for liberation, right? And so I think that we want to keep the spotlight on that. And I did see several questions about university administrations, and has Columbia made a statement? And many Columbia faculty have signed a petition condemning state repression against faculty and students in Iran. But I think it would make a difference. I personally received emails from many students in Iran asking, will the Columbia administration please take a public stand against state repression? Will they express their solidarity with students and faculty in Iran? I think that people in Iran want those kinds of public expressions of solidarity from our academic and professional institutions, as well as our social justice institutions and organizations.
Right. Parisa, you have a hand up, and also Kian, you wanted to say something. I think that one of the things we are talking about here is something that actually resonates for the previous conversation that I moderated for the Committee on Global Thought, which was about reimagining global. And one of the ways we were thinking about reimagining global is actually solidarity of movements and issue interest, which the young people know how to do better than anybody. But that in fact, it is not global only at the intergovernmental level, but it is the solidarity at the people level. It's not even the institutional level, but the people level, which actually can also provide strategy, thinking about where to move forward, best examples, things of that sort. So I think that that's another piece to just remember as we go forward. Parisa?
Yeah, thanks. So I have so much to say about all the discussion, including this generational effect, but maybe I'll just stay close to the current discussion around the sanctions and just say that absolutely the sanctions have been devastated devastating to people in Iran. And I think moving beyond that, even enforcing them or placing them in a way that is much more planned to affect the government more than the actual people, if there is a way to do that. I mean, I had personal experiences from people, other epidemiologists, researchers within Iran reaching out to us to get at our research protocol and things like this that were actually not really allowed to share because of the sanctions for legal purposes. And this is completely a scientific exchange. So I just want to share that personal experience and say that's just one single example of how these sanctions really damage things that are really good for people, including doing research. And then I guess I do think that these kind of, the solidarity and these calls and amplifying voices of people are really, really important. I think the reason I'm here is because I also try to convey the fact that we're hearing about Colombia making statements in solidarity and support. And I think it's important. Going back to this issue with the UN Commission on Women's Rights and how this is coming about, I mean, I think some of that, I think it was a non-competitive process where they were placed in this sort of a leadership position to say about women's empowerment. And I'm not surprised. I don't think they're in violation of women's rights. We shouldn't be surprised by that. But I think some of that came from the pressures and petitions that went around kind of widely, that put the pressures on the member states in UN to start this. So we're beginning to see, I think, effects of that in terms of just, trying to spread the word, have this collective thing. And I think we've done a really good job by taking, some of the marches and demonstrations outside of Iran have really done a lot to take this, slogans of people on the streets of Iran and make it this global chant of Zan Zindagi Azadi.
Kian, a brief comment, and then I want to get to the next question that's come from the audience. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that, given that this is a university forum, what I would encourage, I think it's a good opportunity for students and for other people who are learning about Iran to, become more familiar with the various contradictions and the various challenges in the international sphere of dealing with a country like Iran. I will just throw out that as someone who's a social science researcher, I have tried looking at the question of sanctions, and I should tell you, and I just flagged this not to have a debate. There is very little hard evidence, actually, that sanctions have had economists have tried to look very carefully at the effect of sanctions on society in Iran, and there's very little hard evidence to support the contention that the sanctions have had such a debilitating effect on society in Iran. I flag that only to say that people who are interested in exploring this should be aware of these debates and these ambiguities. The alternative explanation is that whatever suffering the Iranian people are undergoing, it's mostly a result of internal mismanagement and corruption of the government that uses channels that are available to them internationally to be isolated and be corrupt in the way that Manager mentioned. The second point I think that people should be aware of is what an outlier Iran is on the international sphere. As a matter of fact, Iran is one of only 2 countries, Islamic countries, that requires mandatory hijab for women in all public places and all public institutions. So there's one question about why then do many other Islamic countries do not require that? And the question of solidarity, I would say, I guess it's connected to the question of sanctions, is that, I support it, obviously, but I think that we should not overestimate the impact that these kinds of efforts can have inside Iran, particularly since actually working directly on the ground with NGOs and dissident groups inside Iran is now practically impossible. So I would just flag these as things to keep aware. And also, I just finally just to say the geopolitics of supporting, let's say, your government, like the United States, in its dealing with Iran, involves a number of different layers. And I think that people should, look at the different sides of the debate. For example, to the extent that the United States supports, the current nuclear deal and what's called the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal, people can ask themselves, to what extent does that empower the current regime in Iran and make them more legitimate in the eyes of the international community and allow them to repress the dissidents more? So I think that these are some of the questions that I would raise that people would keep in mind as they think about this issue.
Well, I think that what you're pointing out is that every time we look at one thing, we have to be mindful of the context in which we are asking these questions. I'm going to move to the last question, which is on everybody's mind. And Mani J, I hope I will get you right in there. And that is that the question is, where does Iran go from here? And I'm going to have you do a round robin quick answer, which is to say, has this damaged the current regime in a way that will require change? What is your prognosis of the impact of this movement a year from now? And I would like you to answer it in less than 1 minute, each one of you. And let's start with you, Parisa, then Mani J, then Kian, and then Yasmin. Yeah.
So I'm going to be quick. I mean, I think we can only move forward. I think things have changed in a meaningful ways for people in Iran. I think norms of hijab and public spaces have changed. I know they've been dynamic over time, but I think in a more meaningful way. And I think the coalition, the scope, the fervor of the movement have really clearly shown that undermine the legitimacy of this government we know that's the case now for the plurality. And I understand Kian's point that there's definitely a significant portion of the society that still supports this, but that plurality of the population really does not think this is a legitimate government that could be in control. So I don't know where we can go from that. And I would just say that I think it's very hard to predict now the outcomes for 10 years, but my personal wish and hope, which I think is I share with millions of people in Iran, is that these demands are actually realized.
And we have to remember that Supreme Leader is sick. Mm-hmm. And also, let's not forget that the 79 revolution, it wasn't clear when it started as to how it was going to turn out, so that it is hard to predict. It's a folly to predict, actually. So what I want our audiences to know is that nobody can make a prediction. But at what point of inflection is this? And does this feel irrevocable that things will change further? Mani J?
I mean, I think that this represents a vindication of so many of the women who, in the process of the revolutionary movement in 1978 and 79, tried to fight for a society that was neither a Western-backed dictatorship or an Islamist theocratic government, right? And they were sidelined. The demands of so many third world women in their national liberation movements were sidelined in case after case. This is now a vindication, right, of what those women understood, that you cannot have that self-determination, national sovereignty with second-class citizenship for half the population is an unsustainable and oppressive situation. And women are not willing to pay the price for their bodies for this so-called sovereignty of the nation, right? The two should not be counterposed. And so I think this is a big political shift. I think it's a kind of historical shift in terms of the kind of moment in history that we're in. You know what I mean? And I think in terms of Iranian society, I agree with Parisa. I think this is a huge cultural shift. There's no way that the Iranian government is going to win people's allegiance back, right? In terms of ideology or any kind of allegiance, right? All they have is repression. right? They have violence. That's all that they have, right? And so we have to ask, what are the forces that can mitigate that violence? Some of it is what we outside of Iran do, paying attention, amplifying the voices, not moving on, not letting this be like an issue that we kind of forget about, keeping the spotlight and the focus on. But I think also it remains to be seen within Iranian society, what other groups, what other social forces join the movement. Does it really move across the generations in a significant way? Do we see huge sections of government workers going on strike, for example? Do we see sections of the army refusing to carry out orders? I mean, these are the kinds of developments, right, that happen in revolutionary situations, and that I think we would have to see, you know, the sort of balance of forces begin to shift.
Right. So
Even
how
more
does it permeate more
Yeah.
broadly?
Yeah,
What does it mean? And therefore, the inflection point becomes
right.
more of a change than not.
Yeah,
Kian?
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I think just as Manager was saying, I think that if this very significant movement, which has brought a new language and a new idiom and a new set of demands for recognition, very important for Iranian society. If this is going to grow and turn into some long-term change in the way the regime is organized, it would have to experience three types of expansions. One, the middle class and middle-aged groups that were all out in 2009 during the Green Movement, Vishaka, you mentioned that a bit earlier, they would have to come out into the street. And so far, they have not. Then there would be the second expansion to the industrial sector, where, just as Manager said, you'd have to have significant and widespread strikes that would impact the economy. And then third, it would have to get to the security and the army, and there would have to be fractures there. And we have seen no sign of that. So unfortunately, given the situation inside Iran, one of the, probably the only law that I learned studying years of political science was this very pithy statement that organized minorities are more powerful than disorganized majorities. And I speak to people in Iran who, of course, just as Parisa mentioned, I think there's widespread support for the values and objectives of the protesters, but they are fearful. They're fearful of the repression. They're fearful of being hurt or being jailed. And so the balance of power is against them, the young protesters being joined by others.
right.
Finally,
Okay, Kian,
yes, I think
I have to stop because time is running out. I want to make sure that Yasmin, one little brief thing, and then I will turn it over to Dennis.
So, I mean, it's hard for me to add anything other than I think that the memory of protest is long. And I think that the culture of protest is long. And I think that you may not see it today or tomorrow, but you will see that legacy shaping further disaffection, and it will take a whole series of shapes. The second thing I really do want to say is I agree completely with what Manish said about the grassroots element of solidarity, but I also think that it's important to think of the international sphere and the international institutions as centers of power, that you can't just turn your back on them because they enshrine an imperial or a Western-centric set of interests, but that what's important is to be able to find a way in which you develop the grassroots solidarities, you learn from the grassroots solidarities, and you use those to push the institutions. But just through the grassroots, I think that you're leaving on the table.
Yeah. So you need the bottom up and top down relationship. Yeah.
The questions that Kian raised about let's see what really is happening and let's use our tools are also, I think, extremely important. The question in my mind is historically women have been in the streets, have led or had major roles in transformations. And when the transformations occur, not just when there's repression, but when the revolution occurs, they're sent back home. I want to believe that we're now in a historical moment where that's not going to happen, but that's a belief.
I know, because actual facts historically bear out the other way in almost every single instance. With that, I must bring this to an end. We could have gone on for a long time, lots of interest. The only thing I would say to our audiences is that stay tuned, be engaged, learn, and don't think that it's just happening over there, because a lot of this has relationship to the issues we are facing right here in this country too. So global is not over there. Global is relational right at home. With that, thank you all. And I give it over to Dennis again. Thank you.
Oh, what an incredibly rich and robust conversation. Oh my, incredible. On behalf of University Life, I'd like to give a big thank you to Professor Vishakha Desai and each of our panelists for sharing their time with us this afternoon and their thoughts and expertise with us today. I'm eternally grateful. Each of them is incredibly accomplished, and please, you can learn more about them and their work online. Every country, every freedom is hard won. And the people who are taking to the streets across Iran are connected to each other and connected to us. Global fights for human rights. As we witness this moment, it is important that we reflect on the lessons it offers us. So thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in continuing to learn about Iran and recent events, you can visit University Life's website after this program and find a list of articles and resources accessible to anyone who's interested. I hope you will take anything you've learned here today and carry it into your conversations you're having with your own communities. It's important that we keep this going. Today's event was part of a University Life's calendar of events. To find out more about our programming and other initiatives, please check out our website at universitylife.columbia.edu. And lastly, thank you to everyone who has joined today, here and online, to learn and share in this conversation. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.